Okay, in this lesson we'll work on finishing out the shading for the particles in our scene. Okay, so here's where we left off in our previous lesson. So we have the particles that have been set up. We now have some pretty good shading that we've applied to these. Now we want to come in and just finish this out by adding a little bit more detail in the overall texture for this. So if I tap the M key on my keyboard to bring up my material editor, there we go. So here is the material that we set up in our previous lesson. So we have some smoke type effects in here. Now let's come in and maybe add just a little bit more detail to this, maybe so we can just kind of break up the inner portions of these particles. We have a pretty good silhouette here on the outside, but like I said, I'd maybe like to bring a little bit more shading to this inner part. So what we can do is come in and maybe just start to add some additional textures into this. So let's just right click somewhere out here. Let's go to Maps, Standard, and let's plug in a smoke map. It's going to be down here underneath the S's, so smoke. We could also find that exact same map underneath the maps rollout in the standard maps over here under smoke. So a couple of ways to get to it. Now let's double click on this smoke. Maybe double click on the icon here to make that a little bit larger. And let's come in. And right now this is going to be a pretty small amount of detail, so it's going to be really small. So the first thing I'd probably want to do is come in and start to maybe double that size. We'll take that from 100 maybe up to something a little bit closer to 200. There we go. So that should be off to a pretty good start. And let's maybe try to lower the amount of detail in here. So right now the iterations is set up to 5. Let's maybe drop that down to something a little bit lower, maybe 2. That'll maybe take out some of that high frequency noise that we have in here. Now let's take this map and we'll plug this into our gradient. So let's come in here and let's maybe start by taking this middle slider of our gradient. We can just right click and delete that out since we really don't need it. And now what we could do is take where we have this flag 1, that's this texture right here, this flag here. We could take this smoke and plug it into that flag. So now this white material or this white texture that we had previously now shows up with sort of this smoke material mixed in, or this smoke texture mixed in. So let's render that out and see what that does. So in my case, that actually probably makes things maybe a little bit too transparent. It's taken almost too much of the opacity out of it. So let's see what we can maybe do about that. Let's come back in here. We can maybe start to take things like this exponent. Right now it was set to about 1.5, which may be a little bit too high. So one way that we could try this is to try and lower that exponent. In my case, that still might be a little bit too transparent. So if this particular method doesn't work out, we have a few different options, or a couple of different options that we can use to mix these together. So this is one option of mixing your textures together, a pretty straightforward method. Another method that we could use is to actually composite these two back together and using a third node to actually bring those together. So let's come in and maybe take that smoke and let's disconnect it from our gradient ramp. So let's take a look at another example or another option here. Let's right click, we'll go to Maps, Standard, and let's go to Composite. There we go. So here's our composite node. Let's take our first texture and plug that in. Let's make another one. Let's take this, plug it into layer 2. There we go. So now let's go back to our composite node and we can start to play with how these are going to be mixed together. So let's come in and let's try to find some options here. Right now I'm taking my top smoke here. And we'll come in and try to play with this until we find sort of a decent little mixing method. So I sort of like the way that this spotlight looks. I think that's going to be a pretty good option here. We have either that or maybe the overlay mode that gives us kind of a nice mixture of some smoke detail in here from this texture, but also keeping a lot of the brightness from this top gradient. Let's see what that does. I like the way that looks. So let's take this composite and let's plug that into the opacity now. So you can sort of see what we've done here now is we've taken these two textures and blended them together using this composite node, and now we're going to pipe that back into the opacity. So let's see what that does for us. Okay, so that's getting in there now. And in my case, it's maybe adding a little bit too much brightness in some of these little areas in here. So you can see where it's sort of creating some of these little bright spots. So we might come in here and start to experiment, maybe with something a little bit different. That's the nice thing about having these different blend modes, is we can come in here and just continue to experiment until we find something that works a little bit better for us. Let's maybe see what this pin light does. There we go. So in my case, I'm going to go with that. So I like sort of this outer detail that we have in here. Still gives us a pretty nice silhouette with just a little bit more detail now in some of these inner areas, just to sort of help knock that out. So in my case, I'm going to go with that result. I really like the way that looks. Okay, so now at this point, we have our particles that we've set up in this scene. We've got the textures assigned to this. We have the particles shaded the way that we want. So at this point, we are pretty much finished up with all of the dynamics work that we're going to be doing in this particular course. So what we can start to do now is that we have these particles in here, we have the textures all set up, we have the material set up for the entire scene. So now we're ready to come in and start to discuss the lighting and rendering capabilities of 3ds Max, and we'll start to do that in our next lesson.